Minister, and I call the member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's a great privilege to follow the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. I want to thank him for his contribution to this condolence motion. I want to thank the government for agreeing to set aside today's proceedings to honour Bob Hawke and for the energy and the effort that so many government members have taken to prepare speeches and for the generous content of those speeches in tribute to a man that was not of their political party, but I think all recognise made a great contribution to this nation. I grew up, as so many did in this chamber, Mr Deputy Speaker, in a deeply political household that in my case was fiercely Labor. Although I'd had an It's Time badge pinned to my clothes when I was a toddler, the 1983 election is the first election at a federal level that I remember clearly. My mum had taken leave from her job to work in Labor Party headquarters, as she did for all of Hawke's elections through that period. So my brother and I were spending the evening of election eve. I assume my mother was an election party far more enjoyable than mine 6 weeks ago. My brother and I were spending election eve in 1983 at my great-uncle's house, my great-uncle on my father's side. My father's side has a proud but very misdirected Tory legacy in their family, and my great-uncle, who was a dear, dear man, unfortunately was a terrible Tory. And I can still remember to this day the scowl on his face as he looked at me clapping when Bob Hawke walked into the tally room on that evening. I'm not sure I really understood why I was clapping, except that I knew that that's what my mum wanted. Right through my adolescence, Bob Hawke was Australia's Prime Minister, and the first federal election I was entitled to vote at, I got to vote for Bob Hawke. So it's perhaps hard to be entirely objective about a man who was such a giant in those formative years of my life. But on any objective measure, at a far more mature age than I was when I first voted, I'm very clear in my mind that Bob Hawke is Australia's greatest Prime Minister. There is room for reasonable people to disagree about these things, and as the Prime Minister quite reasonably said, the test that John Curtin was subject to during World War II is something that thankfully none of us have never known and hopefully will never know. But Hawke, I think, on any objective test, deserves the title of Australia's greatest Prime Minister. His time as Prime Minister is located in the middle of a period of relatively strong and stable leadership for almost 4 decades, from Whitlam to Howard, a period that we've not known in this place for more than a decade. But the remarkable thing among those 5 Prime Ministers, Whitlam to Howard, the remarkable thing is how quickly Hawke got the job, because all 4 of those other Prime Ministers, Whitlam, Fraser, Keating and Howard, had all served at least 20 years as parliamentarians before they became Prime Minister. Bob Hawke had just served 3, and as the Prime Minister said earlier today, I didn't know this statistic myself, only 36 days as Leader of the Opposition. Truly blessed. But the speed with which he came up to the toughest job in the nation is just extraordinary, because he excelled immediately and right through the course of his Prime Ministership in all of the major areas of public policy as we understand them. On the international stage, as many have said on my side of the chamber and the other side, he was confident, he was hard-working, he was progressive, and he always projected an independent Australian national interest on that international stage. On economic policy, he's universally and justifiably recognised as the Prime Minister who oversaw the modernisation of the Australian economy, with a brilliant treasurer in Paul Keating and a wonderful cabinet as well, setting us up for the 20 years of uninterrupted economic growth that has lifted Australia's prosperity to such a degree over the last almost 3 decades. But he was presiding over not the only economy in the Western world that was undergoing the pressures of the 1980s that Australia was confronting. And his response, or his government's response to that, was something that I think deserves some attention, because this was an era of Reaganomics. It was an era of Thatcher's radicalism. And there was an alternative path to the path that Hawke and Keating steered Australia through, was that path of Reaganomics and Thatcher's radicalism. But instead, Hawke's modernisation of the Australian economy was uniquely and quintessentially Labor. He worked with those workers and those communities in Australia that were being impacted by the pain of unavoidable economic restructuring. Because the truth is, over the sweep of our history, Australia has generally been particularly poor at structural adjustment. We've generally expected communities just to suck it up. I've seen that in my own community over the last 5 years as Australia's car manufacturing industry has shut down. Structural adjustment programs have really just extended to helping workers dust off their CVs and perhaps do some job interview training. Hawke and Keating's and John Button's approach was quintessentially different. It worked with workers, their unions, it worked with local communities and came up with deep, meaningful structural adjustment programs that we've only too rarely seen here in Australia. The car plan, the steel plan, the really deliberative approach to waterfront industry reform that was extraordinarily hard but worked with unions and industry and local government authorities to make sure that as far as possible it spread the pain of that unavoidable economic restructuring. And as we know and has been said so many times already over the last few hours, his social reforms as well as his economic reforms still sit right at the heart of Australian society today. They are enduring. They are now an unstitchable fabric, part of the fabric of Australian society. Medicare, lifting the high school retention rate from 30% to 70%, making meaningful those higher education reforms that Whitlam had started a decade and a half earlier. Universal superannuation, expanding childcare, I think was one of the jewels in the crown of Australia's social reforms during that period because it made practically meaningful the ability, particularly of working mothers, to combine work with their family responsibilities. But the final area of policy I want to address, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the environment. There's already been a number of speakers who have addressed this, particularly the member for Watson, who has had a lifelong devotion to environmental policy. Hawke's granddaughter Sophie told the story, and the member for Watson's relayed it as well, of Hawke's memorial service about protecting Antarctica, and that alone, that was his only environmental protection achievement, in itself would be a giant legacy. But there is so much else besides that: the Tasmanian wilderness, the Daintree, visionary programs like Landcare that have already been talked about. Without question, Hawke is the greatest Prime Minister that Australia's natural environment has ever had. But I want to address the question of climate change as well, because at Hawke's memorial, Sophie also said that in the past several months, Hawke had expressed great sadness that Australia had failed to act on climate change, that he saw it as a collective failure of our nation, that we've traded short-term interests over intergenerational equity. In the 1980s, barely a decade after the term global warming first appeared in Science magazine, Hawke created the Commission for the Future, and some of its earliest work was the Greenhouse Project to examine climate change, its causes, effects and the methods to manage the problem. Before 1987 or 1988, there had barely been a public mention of climate change beyond scientific journals, particularly until the testimony of NASA scientist James Hansen in the late 1980s to Congress in the US. This was part of what I think was a golden era of global climate change cooperation, where no politicians suggested that the scientific community was engaged in conspiracy or suggested that the current generation's economic interests should take priority over longer-term considerations, including the economic interests of future generations. In 1988, the Toronto Conference brought together politicians, scientists and economists from several dozen countries and called upon the developed nations of the world to stabilise carbon emissions at 1988 levels by 2000 and to cut them by 20% by 2005. Now, Hawke was a key supporter of this effort. He spoke passionately in 1989 alongside his then 4-year-old granddaughter Sophie, imploring Australia on the television to think of the long term. Hawke was very clear on the potential of climate change to disrupt Australian life. As he put it, and I quote, "The greenhouse effect, as we called it back then, or global warming, cannot be dismissed as just another environmental problem. It has the potential to change fundamentally within a single lifetime the way all nations and people live and work." Hawke fought the 1990 election campaign largely on environmental issues, including the Coronation Hill gold mine, as we've heard a number of times already this morning, as well as a commitment that a re-elected government would adopt the Toronto position as an interim target, Australia's first emissions reductions target. It's worth noting, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this was a bipartisan position adopted by Andrew Peacock, the then Liberal leader. But as the Hawke years ended and the recession of the early 1990s took hold, the golden era of climate consensus, very short that it was, drew to an end. Powerful lobby groups and companies targeted the science in a manner not seen against any other scientific consensus in the modern era. The powerful tools of self-interest, economic doomsaying and fear took hold in the political sphere, and the landscape was slowly infected with toxic sludge, tearing at the groundwork that Hawke had worked so hard to lay for climate action. To honour Bob, we should continue the work that he began, because Bob knew that we only borrow the planet. We borrow it from our kids, their kids, and so on. I first met Bob almost 20 years ago, an evening as part of the election review conducted after the 2001 Tampa election loss, as it was called then, that he and Neville Rand conducted along with Tim Gartrell. We had a party members forum in South Australia, where, as I recall it, I was blamed for pretty much all of the party's ills at the time, a meeting that was obviously stacked with my factional enemies. After that, the four of us enjoyed a dinner over several hours and several bottles of wine, and Tim and I, pretty young at the time, straight-laced individuals, were exposed to all of the colour of Labor's history over recent decades, the Terrigal Conference and so on and so forth, through Bob and Neville, two giants of the Labor movement. We bonded over a common knowledge of Ray Geetselt, who was the legendary General Secretary of the Union I was the Secretary of at the time, the Missos. Ray had been General Secretary of the Union for decades and was really the driving force that got the numbers for Bob to become the ACTU president in the late 60s, and their love also of Lionel Murphy, who was Ray's best friend and a great friend also of Bob and of Neville. That set, I think, the tone for a relationship that all of us enjoy on this side of the House, no matter how young, no matter how junior and relatively insignificant we've been in the Labor movement, where Bob always treated us as equals and was always incredibly generous with his time to encourage and to advise and to press us to be more ambitious and more progressive and more brave. He really is the most generous Labor figure of his time in the devotion to continual campaigning for Labor and the mentoring of younger Labor people. I last saw him at his home over summer, enjoying a couple of hours with him and Blanche and with Sue Peters-Hawke, his daughter, and a great friend of mine I've worked closely with, particularly around dementia, as well as his dear friend and former advisor Craig Emerson. And as the member for Watson remarked as well, at some point during that afternoon, where he was sharing a cigar with his daughter Sue, he put his hand on my forearm and just said, apropos of nothing really at the time, Paul and I have made up. And it was so clearly a wonderful thing for him personally, but as I remarked to him at the time, such an important thing for our party, that before Bob's passing, he and Paul had broken bread, and the most important partnership of modern Labor had found a way back together before Bob had passed. I want to send my condolences, obviously, to Blanche and his family, Sue and Stephen and Rosalind, his granddaughters, but also to his friends, and I particularly want to mention Craig Emerson, who I know was such a dear friend to Bob for so many years and gave so much of his time in Bob's later months to ensure that Bob's family was supported, that Bob and Blanche personally were supported, but also so that Bob was able to connect with so many members of the Labor Party in his final months. Today we farewell a genuinely exceptional Australian.
Thank you.